what happened a few weeks ago with the capsizing of the Herald of Free Enterprise and the death of, I can't remember how many people they keep dredging up the bodies, don't they? So at least 200 people died. Now, that was the sort of thing that actually, it's become a media show, hasn't it? I mean, it's still, you're still seeing things on the telly. We will have endless investigations. We will have endless sort of accounts of, what happened, why it happened, or whatever. The interesting thing is that when one looks at the popular press, if you read, not even just the Sun, actually, if you read newspapers like the Observer or the so-called serious newspapers, the Guardian or the Daily, not the Tabloids, the Daily Mirror, serious newspaper, I suppose. What you find there are two sorts of explanation of what happened with the Herald of Free Enterprise. One finds the act of God explanation. Really, this is the sort of thing that was going to happen. Let's face it, there are hundreds of these ferries crossing the channel every day, and eventually an accident was bound to happen. I mean, this is in the nature of things. Yes. Interestingly enough, I always find it curious actually to think about these bits about acts of God. Because usually people are saying this are Christians, who believe that God is all powerful. I've never personally been able to understand why isn't there all powerful God can't actually stop these things happening. Why can't they? Why can't this great God actually stop these accidents, or stop the wars, or stop the famines, or whatever, for which he is apparently responsible? But that's one sort of explanation. The other sort of explanation you get is the scapegoat explanation. In this case, they found their scapegoat. I think it's some poor bastard is the bosun. He's the scapegoat. He's the man to blame. He's the one who made the error. Yeah? I'm sure actually the Sun's regretting that they couldn't have found somebody who was a sort of gay, or probably a black gay, Jewish, or Arab, Irish, or something like that, scapegoat. That would really fit with their sort of picture. The reality is that very few people will understand is they haven't read Socialist Worker, or didn't read the very excellent analysis of what took place in Socialist Worker, is that the free enterprise went down and 200 people died because of capitalism. And it actually illustrates perfectly how capitalism works. That what you have there is a ship that was being operated on very tight margins. A ship that had been purpose-built in such a way that it was unsafe, and that reports have been issued time and time again over the past few years saying that it was unsafe. And yet it had been built that way because it was easier apparently to get lorries on and off and cars on and off if you didn't split up that bit, the bit where you had the cars and lorries into separate compartments, which would have made it much safer. It was easier to leave the doors open and get away fast from the ship, because then you can get across the channel quicker, and you can turn around quicker, and there's competition on. They're worried about the Eurotunnel maybe is going to be built. Maybe there are rival shipping lines. They've got to cut the margins down. They also operate with they cut crews. They've been sacking people systematically. There was actually an occupation of ships not long ago. I remember it actually quite a rather nice little struggle actually, although it was sold out by the union leaders in the end, over the sort of efforts that have been made by management of the Sea Link lines and the Townsend-Torrison lines or whatever, to lay people off. So you actually don't have enough people working on these ships to make them safe. And Townsend-Torrison is a company that's actually owned by another company now, recently taken over, a company called P&O, who, because they've recently taken over, of course, have been able to disown all responsibility for it. I mean, it wasn't them. They've sacked, half a dozen of the sort of management team on Townsend-Torrison or whatever. But P&O made £150 million profit last year. They are a successful firm. In a cutthroat competitive business, they are a successful firm. They have made a lot of money. But their money, their profits, their £150 million, come on the basis of doing things that lead to the deaths of 200 people in the channel. I mean, of course, that's an extreme example. It's an extreme illustration of what capitalism can do, and yet actually maybe not so extreme. Because when one looks around the world today, one finds actually, one thinks about what's going on, and one actually probes a little bit deeper than the sort of television headlines or whatever, one finds examples of people dying through famine when there are apparently 25 million tonnes worth of grain stocked up in silos all around the common market, all around in Britain and France. Well, they don't tell you where they are, by the way. I mean, they're worried actually that people might actually go and raid them and take the grain out or something. I don't know. They're keeping secret, but there are 25 million tonnes of grain stockpiled in the common market countries, which would be more than enough to feed people. There are wars going on. In Iraq-Iran war, I don't know whether anybody heard Jonathan Neal's wonderful talk this morning, where he pointed out that this is a war that is actually being financed and fueled by a whole number of other countries who want to keep this war going, and is being also kept going by arms manufacturers in a whole number of different countries who are quite happy to sell to both sides, who are quite happy to actually hand out the weapons of death to both Iran and Iraq. And really actually in a situation like that, the profit motive does not particularly care about whether it's, the final ideological distinctions. And interestingly enough, it's not just, the Americans are involved, the Russians are involved. They're all actually more concerned actually about what contracts they can get, what arms deals they can do. And Britain last year actually was the third biggest arms trader in the Middle East, selling £5 billion worth of missiles or aircraft equipment to Saudi Arabia. Their hands are filled with dirt and muck, and they are people who profit from death, and they're the people who run our system. Now, that's serious, but really, when we go out on a paper sale, or if you're a member of the SWP and you go out on a paper sale, or even if you're not a member of the SWP, but you're in a workplace or you're in a college or you're somewhere and you have these issues come up, it's very important that we actually understand why these things happen. It's very important that we can actually explain, that we don't go to the act of God argument, that we don't turn to it's all the fault of the person who got it wrong, all the fault of the blacks or the Irish or whoever the current favourite scapegoat. Apparently, I think it's the Japanese, isn't it, at the moment, the current favourite scapegoats for the media. They're horrible Japanese workers who work too hard and produce better stereos than British capitalists managed to produce. We need to understand the way capitalism works. And it's fundamental for Marxists, not because we think that everything comes down to the economy, not because we think that, there are no, you can explain everybody's emotions or everything that happens in the world simply on the basis of economic factors, which is what Marxists are sometimes accused of being. But that if you don't start from the way capitalism works, if you don't understand how capitalism works, you won't actually be able to explain very much about anything else at all. And I really want to just somehow give you a very quick, very speedy summary of the key ideas of Marxist economics. That's what I'm going to try and do in the next course of the next 20 minutes. The problem, of course, is that Marx went away and spent a good 10 years of his life slaving away in the British Museum, reading books, not because he thought that reading books was a good thing. His attitude to reading books is roughly the same as Tony Cliff's attitude to reading books. He was quite prepared to do it. He was quite prepared to spend a long time reading books. Basically, it wasn't under any illusions that the revolution was going to come as a result of people sitting around reading books or sitting in the British Museum or whatever. He was a revolutionary through and through. But he believed it was necessary to understand the system. And he did something that has been of invaluable service to socialists ever since. He wrote 3 great, enormous books, only one of which was published in his lifetime. Capital, which he worked on, actually has got some beautifully written passages in it. and which although it looks incredibly sort of like forbidding when you sort of first look at it, believe you me, he knew how to write, so he knew how to inspire people. And two other volumes that came after his death, which are not so easy to read, partly because they were compiled from manuscripts he left behind by Engels, his great friend and associate. Those books, which of course actually, believe you me, I'm not trying to sort of persuade you to go over and read them. I'm not saying people to be socialists have to read those books, but those books have been incredibly important for the socialist movement because they lay down an analysis of the way capitalism works that was not only unparalleled for its time, but is still basically relevant today. Now, I just want to take out 5 key ideas from those books, really 5 key ideas, and just say a little bit about them. The 5 ideas I'm going to talk about are, firstly, labour, secondly, exploitation, thirdly, competition, fourthly, accumulation, and fifthly, overproduction. Now, basically, hopefully, that's going to be enough just dealing with those few ideas, I'm sure, for people to take in. And around that, I want to sort of like try and bring out the relevance of Marx today. Now, let me start with labour, because really I'd like to give you a little poem here, written by a great German Marxist and dramatist. Well, it was a bit controversial because he was a bit of a Stalinist, but he was Bertolt Brecht wrote this wonderful poem, which I forgot to bring with me. Which is all about who built the pyramids and who went and fought in the armies, and how all these great historical monuments and how all these things are possible that we read about in history books when we go to school, And what's so lovely about it is that he says, was it Tutankhamun who built the pyramids? Was it the pharaohs who built the pyramids? Clearly not. Clearly not. Obviously not. It was millions of slaves who built the pyramids. Just like it was millions of workers slaving away who produced the great achievements of the Industrial Revolution, which go down in history books as just a matter of the invention of George Stephenson or the invention of James Watt. It's always seen as a matter of these sort of magical individuals who somehow overnight built Manchester, or built the railways, or created the cotton mills or whatever. Somehow the untold millions of people who laboured are left out of history. But of course, without them, nothing else happens. And without the labour, the day-to-day labour of millions of workers, today, nothing else happens. Nothing else is possible. It is not possible for there to be politicians. It is not possible for there to be priests or whoever, media personalities. All these people who dominate the news today. It's not possible for there to be generals making war. It is not possible for there to be anything without the vast daily labour of millions upon millions of workers throughout the world. And that seems to me blatantly obvious. People say, this is getting into incredible sort of complications about the labour theory of value, whatever. That seems to me a basic, simple fact. It's very easy to forget, of course, if you're, I don't know, if you're sitting around as a student somewhere and, you forget that actually what the meaning of work's all about. But anybody who works for a living, anybody who's actually works, sobbing their guts out, knows what that means. And of course, it shows up when workers stop working. When workers suddenly decide, they don't want to go to work anymore. Or maybe they'll go on strike, or maybe they'll just refuse to go to work. And this was terrible. This is sabotaging the country suddenly, or this is blackmail, or whatever the handy catchphrase will appear in the sort of like the daily press. Workers suddenly decide they don't want to go to work for a day. Actually, it's all right as long as you do it on your own. What's terrible about it, of course, is if they all do it together, and then suddenly the system begins to seize up. Suddenly the railways don't run. Suddenly the factories close down. And suddenly, the power of workers, which actually rests on the fact that they are the people who labour, they are the people who create the wealth in society, they are the people who produce the profits, who produce what becomes the profits of the capitalist class in the system. That suddenly is exposed to view. And that's really sort of like the most fundamental thing that Marx said. The second thing that Marx said, and this doesn't just apply to capitalism, of course, this applies to earlier class societies, is that really going back 10,000 years, so roughly around 10,000 years ago, we get the emergence of the exploitation of one class by another. Now, I don't want to go into the history of that or how that happened, but it was quite possibly, I think, dealt with in the first talk in this series. Just to say that it was only became possible actually because there had been a certain development of the forces of production. What Marx meant by the forces of production was the tools, the instruments, the means of production, machinery as it is today, the elaborate systems of technology or whatever. Everything from, if you like, the simplest tool, the hammer, the bow and arrow or whatever, right up to the most complicated machinery which workers create and use. Those are the means of production. And when the development of means of production had reached a certain stage where it was possible for a surplus to be created, for workers to produce more than they actually needed to live on daily, more than the basic subsistence minimum on which most of them had survived, relatively equally, but it was an equality of misery, an equality of primitive communism for many, many thousands of years before that, when eventually you got to a stage in the development of society where a surplus emerged. That surplus was monopolised by a small, tiny group of the population who were able to take control and see. And that goes hand in hand with a whole number of other developments, but I don't want to go into the development of a state, development of armed bodies of men in order to ensure that the small minority who got control kept that control, and so forth. Exploitation is really basically very simple. It means that one class lives off the back of another. It means that society is divided into two basic classes, one of which does the work, and the other of which basically controls, runs the whole process on the basis of their ability to force the other people to work for them. But under capitalism, that isn't as obvious as it is in slave societies or earlier societies. I just want to say a little bit about what's peculiar in some ways about exploitation under capitalism. Because under capitalism, workers are not slaves. They are, as everybody, all the history books tell you, they were freed from slavery. I mean, this was one of the capitalism's great historical progressive achievements. It eventually did away with slavery. Not entirely true, of course, that capitalism wasn't quite happy to tolerate slavery where it thought slavery was useful. And indeed, capitalism actually drew profits and drew blood out of the slave trade in its earliest period of time. But basically, capitalism does not rest on slavery. It rests on the notion of the free worker. And actually, the slave system is too inflexible, too limited for capitalist point of view. Capitalism actually wants and needs workers who are free, or free in a particular sense of the word, who will don't actually have to be kept under lock and key, for 24 hours a day, but who will actually willingly go to work, who will turn up every day, go to work, get there 9 o'clock in the morning, work throughout the day, quite often actually even work even when there's not a foreman there, it's amazing, Who will stop work at lunchtime, go off, and then come back, and then, whatever, and they go on doing it week in, week out. And sometimes, actually, people will even stop work and they'll go and get another job, and it's often said, isn't it? Oh, you don't like it here, you can go down the road, you always get another job. Or it used to be said, of course. I mean, it's not quite so easy now, but when I was young, actually, there was a certain sort of reality there that people could actually chuck their job and go and get another one somewhere. But that freedom is also fundamentally an illusion as far as the reality of the day-to-day situation of workers in the workplace is concerned. It's an illusion in two senses. It's an illusion because really, basically, you don't have a choice not to work. And what fundamentally defines workers in this society is that they have nothing to sell but their labour power. And what Marx meant by that, nice little phrase, was workers have their ability to labour. That is what they own. They can do with that what they like. Abstractly, they can do with that what they like. But of course, to have that ability to work, but not to have the machines to work with, not to have the factories, not to have the buildings, not to have the land, means actually that you can't do anything, can you, in this society? I mean, okay, maybe you can go and steal or beg or whatever, But by and large, for the vast mass of the population, you have no choice but to go to the people who do have the machinery, who do have the factories, who do have the offices, who do have the money. And where do they get that from? Well, actually, where they got that from, you have to date that right back in history to the initial sort of like process whereby a capitalist class emerged and whatever. They got it basically from robbery and theft and pillage and all sorts of incredibly unscrupulous ways, and they're still getting it like that. But basically they don't need to do that anymore. They don't need to do that anymore precisely because the system has become established, it's routinized, and workers will go to work and accept the idea that they have to go to work and not challenge the idea that the fact that a very tiny minority of the population, and it's still the case that 1% of the population, but actually really less than 1% of the population, constitute the people who control all the key corporations in this society, and control the government, and control the whole ruling apparatus. Less than 1% of the population. I've got a little pamphlet, I won't go through it, it was actually a little bit boring pamphlet, actually produced by Google, the Labour Research Department, listing a mere 200 people in Britain today who are multi-millionaires. That is people who own more than £1 million worth of shares in companies. At the top, believe it or not, comes the Queen. By far the biggest, then you get the Duke of Westminster, and actually, in terms of individual shareholders, I was really quite surprised to see that Robert Maxwell actually was really rather high up actually on the list. On the Sainsbury family, they're very, I don't know whether you saw it in the news, they're very bountiful these days. They're sponsoring the arts and the National Gallery, whatever. Believe it or not, actually, those people don't just get a salary by people like the guy who runs Sainsbury's. Doesn't just get a salary of a couple of £1 million a year. He's also got shareholdings worth £10 million, which are generating massive dividends for him, year in, year out. That situation of a very tiny minority who are actually living off the backs of the rest of us is as true today as it ever was. And actually it's also true even when you don't have shareholding systems or whatever. You can have the ruling class can organise itself in different ways. They can operate like they do in Russia, where you don't have private property, you just have a rather small, tiny bureaucratic elite that manages to sort of like, take its rake off in a rather different way and has its special privileges and its perks and its villas and its whatever. But it's basically the similar sort of situation. Now, the third thing I want to say is that to explain the way capitalism works, you cannot just simply refer to the exploitation of one class by another. By the way, I'm sure people are all sorts of ways thinking to themselves, what about the middle class? Or what about the people who really is exploited and who really isn't exploited or whatever? But come back on that maybe. I'll talk about that in questions. Let me get on, because I'll be running short of time otherwise. Let me leave that aside. Let me talk about the question of competition. Because to understand the way capitalism works, one has to see it not just as a matter of exploitation, although that's the fundamental thing, the relationship between capital and labour, the class on top and the class on the bottom. One also has to see the way in which capitalists compete amongst each other. Because that actually is something also that's relatively distinctive about capitalism compared to earlier class societies. One has a situation in which there isn't just a single capitalist, there isn't even just a single block of capitalists, there are many capitalists. There are lots of them. And they're not just concerned with screwing us, they're also concerned with screwing each other. If you like, imagine a situation as one in which all the workers are producing and tossing, if you like, producing for the sake of this great big pool, but then the capitalists then come along and have got to divide that pool of resources that workers create up amongst themselves. And they will also fight amongst each other in all sorts of ways to carve that pool up, so that they can also get a bigger share of the pool, if you like, not just at the expense of workers, but at the expense of their rivals. And ultimately it all comes to the workers, but they're also competing with each other. But who can get the biggest markets? Who can control the raw materials? Who can dominate a particular industry or particular situation? And that competition takes many forms. Most fundamentally, of course, it takes the form of competition on the market. The Japanese competing with American companies or British companies or whatever. These days, of course, not even, it's hard even to tell whether they're British companies. I mean, most of the top British companies now are actually big multinational companies producing in many parts of the globe. But they're still competing with each other. It also, of course, takes other forms. At times, the bloody forms of war, of military competition, when actually capitals actually get to the point where in order to expand, in order to build up their markets, they have to go out and start taking over other bits of the world. And even today, even when by and large, the sort of like the old world of empires has gone, outside the sort of like, outside of a few sort of like parts of the world, including, of course, Northern Ireland. The leftovers of the old empires, by and large, even today, I can still see the way in which capitalists seem to dominate whole industries on a global scale. They're not simply concerned with controlling their own little patch in their own little country. They're concerned with actually going out and setting up major cartels. The role of the oil companies continue to play, actually. It's very interesting. The oil price has been going down rapidly. I was really struck the other day, I just tossed this in, to note that the profits of BP and the profits of Exxon, the two of the biggest oil companies in the world, Exxon's that comes out as unless have been going up last year. And how do you explain that? It's very odd, isn't it, really? The oil price has been going down. The countries that actually produce the oil, and many of the sort of like, many of those countries are in far bigger trouble even than Britain, the Nigerias, the Saudi Arabias, the Venezuelans, the Mexicos and whatever. They're in bad trouble. And the oil producers are, actually, some of them have been able to increase their profits. Why? I don't know, I can always toss that out and ask you why, but I'll give you what I think is the answer. These people operate in two ways. They both produce the oil, but of course they also sell the oil. And these days, for the oil companies, the most important part of their operations is not producing oil. In many parts of the world, that's already been nationalised. It was taken over by the Saudi Arabians or the Venezuelans or the Libyans, whoever it is. The most important part of their operations is actually selling oil as petrol or in various other forms. They refine it and they sell it onto the other market. And whilst the oil price for the producing bit of the system has been going down, because the oil companies are still able to control the price of petrol in garages, they've actually been able to increase their markup. So they've been able to, if you like, to show, okay, the Saudi Arabians are suffering because all they get is a cut of, the cost of the oil and where it's actually at the point where it's actually produced. But the oil companies are still able to get together to fix, really, the price of petrol and the price of a whole number of other products. So what they lose in the North Sea, or where they're actually producing oil, they simply make up on the other side, when they're actually selling it as petrol in the garages to people like you and me. So their profits are actually maintained. They can fix the market. They can actually get together. Makes you sick, doesn't it? Anyway, so I just thought I'd yet another little illustration. I'm running out of time. I must speed up. Accumulation was my fourth concept. And here I just really want to give you a little quote from Marx that I think is still interesting. Because Marx argued that we have to understand the way in which capitalism has changed the world for us in all sorts of ways which are extremely progressive and extremely positive for humanity. He wrote in his very famous work that I hope people will read if they haven't already read, the Communist Manifesto, something that's been described as one of the best accounts of the great merits of capitalism, believe it or not, that have ever been written. He wrote a tribute to the creative powers of the bourgeoisie. And he wrote, "The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionising the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production and with them the whole relations of society." He goes on. The bourgeoisie during its rule of scarce 100 years has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalisation of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labour? And he goes on like that. I can give you more. It's a wonderful passage. What he's saying there is that there is something distinctive about capitalism's development of the forces of production, which we have to recognise and which is very important for the whole development of mankind. And that arises out of this whole business of accumulation. Because what competition leads to between capitalists is something quite distinctive. It means that whereas in earlier class societies, by and large, when the rulers they got their loot, what they did was they went away, they blew it. They go off and have a, they build a great big palace, or they go and have a war, or they sort of, they sort of have a great big beano, and sort of blow it all, really, in one way or another. Well, by and large, what the capitalist class does, I mean, it's quite capable in periods when periods of crisis of reverting back to that sort of behaviour. But in periods when the system is expanding, what one sees is enormous pressure on capitalists to invest a large part of the surplus that they get from workers back into the process of production. And that's very important. They invest their profits back into the process of production in the form of new machinery, new factories, new buildings, whole new massive sort of methods of communication, railway lines, telecommunications or whatever. And of course, when Marx was writing, it was 1848, what we've seen in the 140 odd years since then has been, a further extension of that, a much more massive scale. They have revolutionised the world for us. They have created a possibility, actually, of a world without classes, which, for us is something, of critical importance. They have made it possible for, humanity to do away with the necessity of millions of people going to work for, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, week in, week out, for most of their lives and finally ending up in the scrap heap. That is no longer necessary. They've made it possible to do away with hunger. There is more than enough food in the world to feed everybody. It's as simple as that, I mean, agriculture has actually seen more of a revolution in technology in the last 20 years than any other sphere of production. There is more than enough food available to feed everybody. There is more than that. The possibilities are unimaginable. In fact, if capitalism didn't waste so much of the wealth it produces on arms production and all sorts of other appalling ways, or if it didn't actually dump, yes, I'm coming to you, yeah? If it didn't actually do things like dump food or plough up the land or whatever, and I'll come, very briefly, I want to say why they do that, then we could actually have a society in which everybody had at least their very basic needs met. And yet, the great contradiction of capitalism, Marx used that word, contradiction, in a very, very, very important sense, he said. The great contradiction of capitalism is that the growth of the forces of production comes into conflict with the relations of production of society. What he meant by that was that capitalism, in developing the forces of production, actually undermines its own conditions of existence. In particular, it undermines actually the conditions of making profits. It becomes more and more difficult for capitalism to make profits. I'm not going to go into or elaborate the arguments about that particularly here. I mean, there are other meetings and other discussions. If you come to Marxism, 87 it'll be one or whatever, things like that, you'll find many meetings actually going through these arguments. But basically, it's easy to see around us, isn't it? A world in which, on the one hand, these incredible, fantastic developments of new technologies, incredible developments of the forces of production that have taken place over the last 150, 200 years, and yet we are still in a situation where millions of people are on the dole. We are still in a situation where millions of people are starving. We're in a situation where actually capitalism is going deeper into crisis and deeper into problems. Why? And this is the final thing. I'll just give you a little quote from Engels. Another wonderful little book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. You can get these books really cheap, by the way. It's 45p for that one. I've got a mate who works in the bookshop, It's 45. He lent me these on the condition that I could give him a little bit of publicity. 45p for each, and you couldn't get a better buy, believe you me. Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific talked about. Again, I've got no time really to give you the lengthy quote I really wanted to give you. But he talks about the way in which he was talking at his time in the 19th century, the way in which you get the fantastic developments of production leading to a situation which suddenly trade comes to a standstill. Markets are glutted. Products lie around in piles as massive as they are unsaleable. Hard cash disappears. Factories are idle. The working masses lack the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of them. Notice that. Working classes lack the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of them. That incredible sort of paradox, really. And yet, nothing could be more relevant today in a situation where you get, masses of people starving at a time when actually they have produced too much. They have produced too much food or too many cars or whatever. Not because people don't need those food or don't need the ships or don't need the cars or the uses can't be found for them, but because it is no longer profitable to produce them. Because in order to sell them, actually the capitalists would actually have to cut their prices right down. It's quite, there's a very simple solution to the problem of overproduction capitalism faces. It's to give the goods away. They could have done that with the food. They could still do that with the food mountains. They could do it with the cars or whatever. You can give things away. Why not? That's socialism. That is actually allocating things according to human need instead of the principle of making profits. Why isn't that possible? It's not possible because we live in a society that is governed by the pursuit of profit, and because they are not even going to allow a little bit of giving away. They're not even going to allow just those stocks of food that they've got piled up which are utterly useless to them. They're not even going to give those away because it would threaten to undermine the whole system of operation. Because it would actually threaten the whole basis on which they operate, which is the idea that if you haven't got the money, you can't buy things and you can't have things. And that's just your answer. That's the market. That's free enterprise. That's how capitalism doesn't work. The only solution is really the solution that Marx and Engels were talking about way back in the 1840s, the 1850s and 1860s. And which is nearer now than it was then, for a very simple reason. I'll finish on this. Capitalism does one more thing. It creates its own gravedigger. It creates the working class that is capable of overthrowing it. And I laugh when I hear the idea that the working class is getting smaller or is disappearing or what. It's an absurdity. If you look at the world today, and we must look at the world. Let's leave aside the question of what's happening in the world today. But when we look at the world today, the working class, the industrial proletariat, and it wasn't not just a matter of industrial workers, but the industrial proletariat itself is bigger today than it has ever been in the history of capitalism. When Marx wrote capitalism in the sense of industrial production, factory in its fully developed sense, was confined really to a small part of the global system. Britain, bits of Europe, parts of North America. Today it is worldwide. Today there is no part of the world that is not part of the capitalist system. Today we have massive working classes in India, in China, in South Korea, in Brazil, in Argentina, in South Africa, capable of fighting back and capable of overthrowing the system. Okay. Anyway, I might leave while workers fight for socialism till sort of final summing. But I'll try and deal with a couple of the questions. It might provoke some sort of response at least. The interesting thing about I'll take white collar workers first. It seems to me that there is an enormous confusion, which isn't helped actually by, certainly, if you read sort of like a lot of the literature about the press on it, people talk about the working class as if it was just manual workers. Yeah? As if you're a nurse, you're not a worker. Or if you're, a lousy paid DHSS civil servant, getting less money by and large than most manual workers I know anyway. You're not a worker, you're somehow. Now, of course, historically, if you go back a long way, the white collar workers were privileged workers. And in fact, actually, you could be a worker with privileges as well. That's another issue. But there was, if you like, a thin line of demarcation, if you like, between the position of managers, people who were running the thing, and the person who was the clerk or the office worker or whatever. Today, that is no longer the case. Today, one is talking about Today one's talking about really, office workers employed in conditions which are, fundamentally proletarian. It's not just they sell their labour power like anybody else. They are subject to the day-to-day control of capital. Their whole sort of work situation is really, at best, marginally superior to those of people who are, coping with the dirt and grease of the factory floor. There's no reason why we shouldn't say they are workers. Absolutely no reason at all, in my opinion. The vast mass of low-paid office workers in the civil service are not workers, or whatever. What is true, however, there's also another layer which has grown at the same time of people, if you like, who are sometimes called the new middle class. People who are in a much more contradictory position. People who are, lower levels of management. Technicians. People who have, to some degree, independence in their job, a certain amount of control, of authority, maybe over other workers or whatever, but who are still selling their labour power, and are still really working for, a boss who is even higher up the scale. Those sorts of people, I think, you can say, well, they're in between, but they're not. They're head teachers, university lecturers maybe. I mean, there are all sorts of there's all sorts of fuzziness here. You can get your enormous, ferocious arguments. Again, Ian Birchall insists that polytechnic lecturers are workers. I don't happen to agree with it. I think they are part of a new middle class. It doesn't bother me. I work in an FE college, and I'm quite happy to be seen as, for some purposes, as being part of a new middle class. I am. And in other senses, I'm a worker. I sell my labour power, belong to trade unions. I go on strike. I have to fight, try and fight against the sort of deals that are being pushed through by the government. Whatever. The important point, of course, is that the working class may have changed, but it remains by far the largest section of society. And people should read a very good article by Chris Harman in the International Socialism Journal a couple of issues ago that goes into this, in some detail if they really want to follow the issue up. Somebody's frowning at me and say, am I dodging the question? The working class has changed its composition. But it has not, in my opinion, decreased in size. It's got bigger in size. The question, of course, is one of whether or not many of those people identify themselves as workers. I'm losing my voice now. This is terrible. Some people are going to have to come back and talk because I can't possibly keep going for much of it. All right. Now the question about the basic human needs. I think you're right. It's Marx said historical elements and what he called moral elements, which we might subjective elements, enter into the definition of what basic human needs are. In this society, it's a basic human need, in my opinion, to have a television set. Seriously, I'm serious about that. If you don't have a television set, you're deprived. 95% of the population have television sets. Not to have a television set, if you can't afford one, means you're really, really poor. It's an index of deprivation in this society. But by basic human needs, of course, we mean most fundamentally the need to be housed and clothed and fed, and those are the basic human needs that matter to people in Jamaica, or matter to people in Ethiopia or Sudan or whatever, where they're not being met. Those basic human needs, I don't think, are a problem. They can just simply be met by free allocation. The way in which we allocate, we say that to be ill, to be healthy, is a basic human need. And that actually principle is still just about recognised in the National Health Service. I have a battered, awful with prescription charges or whatever. That is a basic socialist idea represented in a particular institution. That people who are ill don't have to pay the way they have to pay in the United States and many other countries around the world in order to be treated. That principle can be extended over a much wider range. That everybody should have a decent house. There's no problem about that. Everybody should be properly fed. Everybody's kids should be brought up, in a way that ensures that they're healthy and, well fed and so forth. Beyond that, of course, in a socialist society, there will be arguments. Beyond that, the question of how do we allocate resources, what are the basic human needs and what aren't, will be the sort of things that actually will have to be thrashed out. We're not, it's not a matter of saying, we're going to sit here and decide you're going to get this or you're going to get that. That is a Stalinist notion of, what socialism is about. So saying, the ruling bureaucracy, in fact, will say, which in fact in Russia and whatever allocates its priorities first to itself and to the arms sector or whatever, and then leaves everybody else last. Under socialism, people will actually have to argue out whether it's more important, say, to ban motor cars, and have a proper, decent public transport system, which I'd be in favour of, because I can't drive. You know, I think motor cars are just horrible, you know, I just hate them. Because I ride a bike, you know, through the streets of London, believe you me, you know, build up real hatred. You know. That would be my position, but many, you know, it's, you know, many workers may well say, no, you know, we want to have, you know, cars and the right for cars to come in and out as big cities or whatever. Those sort of issues will be thrashed out, and, you know, thrashed out in a sort of way that isn't possible in this society. Because you can't actually make those sort of decisions. They're made by the road lobby and the road transport lobby or whatever, who fix it up with the Ministry of Transport, the Department of Transport or whatever, and they're the ones who, and the government, and they're the ones who decide how much is going to be spent on roads. And finally, a bit about the question about third world countries and socialism. I think one should. I just want to say two brief things about that. One is that one shouldn't have a notion of the third world as being, a universal morass of poverty, and, peasants or whatever slaving away. It's not all like Ethiopia or Sudan. That is an extreme case. If one's talking about those countries, one is talking about, even there, about workers who've got power in the cities. The workers in Sudan, the railway workers went on strike, brought down the government in Sudan. They brought down the government of Numeri in Sudan 2 years ago. They brought the workers who went on strike in Addis Ababa, in the capital of Ethiopia. I can't remember when was that? Anyway, so a few years, 7 or 8 years ago, overthrew the highly reactionary feudal government of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. Workers in those countries have power, but maybe they won't be the ones who are leading the revolution on the world scale, precisely because of the, hunger makes people submissive. Starvation actually knocks people back. But you ask me, how will socialists bring socialism to those countries? The answer is, I think what we would do first of all is we would take food to those countries, and then we would let them decide whether they thought socialism was a good thing. Personally, I would have thought that people who recognise that socialism in other countries led to them getting food being supplied for free might actually realise that that was something that was worth defending and worth lining up with. And I'm sure that once socialism is established in a particular country or a particular group of countries, the example that will provide, like, however briefly, the example of Russia after 1917, will have an enormous impact on workers. That is our great problem today. We cannot point to anywhere and say that is socialism. But, once it's established, I think, once we've done it in one place or 2 or 3 places, we will have to spread it, obviously. But spreading it will